You were saying?
I said until the Depression hit Victor's family, which must have been starting in 1930, let's say, and from then on, his lifestyle had been, for the first 5 years of his life, we've been a very prosperous family. And my family had ins and outs and down and up all through, really all through our lives. And yet there were periods that my mother was given an allowance by my father of $75 a week, and that must have been during a prosperous time. And he tried giving her that for a long time. And what she used to do, and that was to cover the food, and it was to cover everything in the household. It was to cover most of the bills of everything. And that 75 must have been a good amount of money in those days. Anyway, the part that was interesting was that my mother started to sew. And when the kids were younger, she made all their clothes. And so the money my dad was giving her, he didn't care how she used it as long as she didn't ask for more. So she used to put some of it in the old-fashioned way under the mattress. And then when his business really went down, which it did from time to time, and he was without money, she would hand him $1,000 that she had saved over the last 5 years. And I used to, we all knew about this because she was so proud of the fact that she had saved all this money from sewing, and she had saved it from other way we were eating, perhaps. I'm not sure what other way she had of saving it. So the business of the in and out of apartment buildings and in and out of apartments was typical of everything in their life. It wasn't just the moving. It was an unstable monetary life, going from ups to downs all the time. And there were times when she had a fur coat. There were times when she went on a trip to Atlantic City with him. I mean, that was considered a great thing in those days, for you to go off to Atlantic City to a nice hotel for the weekend, and they did those kinds of things. And I think she never went to Europe with him. He went to Europe many times because his machines were eyelet machines. You know what?
Was that the brand or eyelet was the kind of,
Eyelet's a material.
Yeah.
Eyelet is the cotton material that the machines use to make embroidered looking things. They're not hand embroidered, but they're machine embroidered. And they have openings and closings. You've seen them. They're still around. They come in and out seasonally, just like they used to, except in the old days. I don't know. Fluctuation in the textile industry is probably just as bad for some families as it was in those days. But, you never knew when you went off to do something, whether you'd be able to continue in college, for example. It was a good example that my sisters were able to go to NYU
But so they never had savings. He never got to the point of having significant savings during those years.
My mother was the only one who saved.
And what were the machines? So the machines were German, the machines were...
Or Swiss.
Mm-hmm. And he owned them.
He
and had a
bought them
factory?
and paid them off. That's right. So he did accumulate money to buy those machines and have them sent over.
And then where did
and
he have...
And then he sold the machines at certain points, so I don't know exactly how the selling of the machines worked, but he wasn't, at one point when the machines were not available to him because he had sold them, he would probably rent them back. Or, who he had sold them to with the understanding that he could use them if it was... I'm not certain of how that worked. But I know that initially he bought the machines with another man whose name I think was something like Herskovitz or something. I can't quite remember what his name was, but I knew it for a long time because he was his partner in buying the machines and in everything they did for many years.
Well, how important was your mother's family to his business?
Not important. Oh, it was very important at the beginning. Only at the beginning, because, you know, I never got the full story on how my mother and father met. But, you know, they got married in 1914. It was a long time ago. And at that time, well, my dad was born in 1892. Supposedly the same year as my mother. Both of them were born then. So 8 and 14, that's right, it's 22. My parents were about 21 when they got married, both of them. And I think that my mother and my father might have met through the grandfather, my mother's father, who was in the women's clothing business at that time. Prior to that, her father was in, when he came over from Lithuania as an 18-year-old, 20-year-old, and it must have been sometime in the 1870s, I gather, from just trying to calculate the time. He got into the textile area, and this is the grandfather now that I'm talking about, my mother's father.
Yeah.
And he, at that time, got into something called the notions business. And the notions were all the things you needed to make your own clothes. Everything. Including, they got into the fabrics that they bought for women to make clothes. And men, I guess, too. But he set up, did you know the story of where he set up his stores for notions? He had a notion store in Bangor, Maine. He had a notion store in Muskegon, Michigan. This was when he really was doing very well. As a young, this is grandfather, Sanders. And he had 3 sons, and he set them up in stores. Oh, he had 3 brothers that he set up initially for the notions business in stores in those places. And one in Ohio, in Springfield, Ohio. So he must have figured out where in the country people were going and where the Jewish community in particular was settling and where the notions business was needed. There were no places for people to buy the things they needed to make clothes. So they had everything, the threads and all the things you needed for this. And those were very successful. But then, and again I need to look up the years, the ready-made clothing business began in this country, and big companies started to produce massive clothing for women. So my grandfather moved into that and left the notions business behind, and he became a buyer for a couple of stores that were distributing ready-made women's clothing. And then when that inspired him at that point to save up the money, which I guess he was able to do, to open up his own store for ready-made clothing, he, by that time, he had a son, Mo, the oldest child in his family, and he put him in charge of the store in Springfield, Ohio, which was the store that then became the pride of his work, because the store was very successful. It was a department store really for women's clothes, and it lasted for the next, well, it was still going in 1948 when Victor and I went to California for the first time. We stopped and stayed in his house in Springfield, Ohio, saw the store for the very first time, which was impressive. And they lived in an exquisite home, a really beautiful setting. He had married a woman from Cincinnati. And Cincinnati is where my father's family settled. He stayed in New York, but nobody else stayed in New York at that time. The family...
Your father's family?
my mother's.
You mean your
Excuse me, that was a
grandfather's
mistake.
family?
The same person I've been
The
talking
grandfather.
about, Grandpa Sanders.
Right.
His family, not him,
Right.
but his mother and father who had come over, and the other parts of the family that I really never knew. In fact, we never even knew them until we moved to California in 1948. It was the first time we met my father's youngest sister, whose name was Fanny.
Right. Right.
That's always been a very strange tale that I've never been able to put the pieces together. How my grandfather could have had a sister 25 years younger than him. And yet that's the story, that she was his sister, and that we never knew that she had this. My mother knew, because it was my mother that looked up this Fanny when we got out to Berkeley in 1948. But now, in retrospect, it doesn't surprise me, because my mother never talked about anything that had an element of concern about it, to the extent that she wasn't able to talk about it without being very emotional. She couldn't face those kinds of emotions. That's why we never, with so many things we never knew as kids until we grew up and somehow discovered it ourselves, that she couldn't share.
Well, like what?
Well, like I never knew the fact that she had a child who died of polio, which was just unbelievable, that you could grow up and only learn that from your aunt. So that Aunt B was the one who had told us about the story.
But I can't remember whether that child was born before the others or in between you and the girls.
It was her first child.
Her first child died.
It was the first child. We have pictures of her in that album.
Yeah.
A beautiful, beautiful little girl. So my mother actually had 4 daughters, and this was the first child. And her name was Bernice.
And she died
of polio.
At what age?
2.
2.
Out at the beach in Far Rockaway.
Mm.
The family went to a place called Edgemere. I don't know if it still exists under that name. I don't think so. But she went there every summer after she was married. Every summer. Probably, that's not true. It's for just the first couple of years, and I think after this child died, they didn't go back to Edgemere. They went to Long Beach. Yeah. Which is about 10 miles away.
Yeah.
But
so when you say things that were not
close community where people sort of came in the summer, it was a really Jewish summer resort. Yeah. At the beach, and polio spread through the whole community that summer. It was terrible.
Well, when you say that nothing went in stride, I mean, how would you characterize your parents' relationship?
Nothing went in stride.
That was the. But does that mean, was it loud?
Well, let's put it this way. I think whatever the relationship was for the first 2 years, after that baby died, the distance between them, it was never quite. It must have done something to the relationship when the baby died, because neither of them could talk about it. They couldn't tell us. They probably couldn't talk to each other about it. It was so devastating. It was so sad. It was really... and it explains, Isabel, who was the next child, and I don't know if they were pregnant with her at the time or whether they became pregnant afterward. I'm not sure. But she was born not more than maybe a year after that. Maybe less, I'm not sure. Anyway, the point is that Isabel was really spoiled, indulged,